Welcome everyone to PAVE's 8th virtual panel. Today we are discussing a topic that is very near and dear to my heart because until I started working here at PAVE, I would have been on the other side of this discussion instead of moderating it, as I was working as a journalist. So today's topic is covering autonomous vehicles. We thought this was just it'd be good to have an opportunity to have three of the most respected journalists that are covering automated vehicle technology today come and share their view of the space, the challenges of covering it, some of the issues around nomenclature, and hopefully provide a kind of unique perspective that doesn't often get heard because journalists are typically more focused on telling this story than sort of explaining their own personal perspective. So to do this, we're joined by, as I've said, three of really the top-notch journalists in this field. I'm really glad they could all join us. First, Kirsten Korosec. She is my colleague on the Autonocast. She is also the senior reporter for mobility at TechCrunch. Kirsten, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And we have Pete Bigelow. He is the Silicon Valley reporter at Automotive News. That is still the title, right, Pete?
I think it's senior reporter officially, but for all intents and purposes, Silicon Valley is in my purview. Yes.
Yes. So I was lucky enough to work with Pete briefly at Automotive News, and thank you, Pete, for joining us as well today.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
And finally, Junko Yoshida is the global co-editor of AspenCore Media, of which EE Times is the flagship. She's a roving editor leading global editorial expansion of AspenCore, and frankly, a legend in automated vehicle technology coverage. Junko, I have not had the chance to work with you or even meet you in person yet, but I'm really honored that you were able to be here today.
Well, thanks for having me. That's great.
Yeah. So before we get started, one of the unique things about covering autonomous vehicles and automated driving technology is that none of us in this generation of reporters, set out to do this really. And so I thought to start, it would be really interesting to just share, and also so the audience can get to know you a little better and understand where you're coming from, sort of how you came into covering this space. And Junko, we'll start with you.
Okay. So I didn't even have the let alone autonomous. I didn't have the automotive background at all. And I was actually thrown into this automotive coverage at a time when there was a Toyota unintended acceleration case. And there was a case in Oklahoma. And it turns out it wasn't the state of Oklahoma, it was the city of Oklahoma. That's the only case that Toyota didn't settle. So this is the whole court scene that I was able to cover the documents and hear I was remotely covering it, but I could get all the documents of who said what. So that was really the beginning of my career as a journalist covering automotive. And that was actually a really good start because that made me really realize what's at stake. It's people's lives at stake. And it's about technology and the humility that you don't know enough. Are we going to take Toyota's word for it? Are we going to take the expert witnesses' word for it? You realize you are so handicapped because you don't know much, right? So that was a really good start. But that also grounded me what I needed to learn.
All right. And Pete, you're at Automotive News. Before that, I think you were at Car and Driver, so you do come from more of an automotive background, but you've covered other stuff as well. Give folks a little bit of a background on how you got towards automated driving.
Yeah, it's kind of unusual. Some people might know that I started my career as a sports writer, and I did that for about a decade, and now it's been another decade covering the general automotive space. And started covering like the Midwest economy, which is all focused around the auto industry once I got out of sports writing, and quickly started covering some of the major safety cases, kind of like Junko did in the auto sphere, specifically Takata airbags and GM ignition switch crisis. So that was my, sort of similar story where I was paying a lot of attention to automotive safety and really, taking note of how many people die as a function of our transportation system on a daily and annual basis. So that really got me interested when Google came along with its self-driving car project about the promise of self-driving technology to limit those deaths and injuries. And long story short, that's kind of been a slippery slope into covering self-driving technology. And Ed, you mentioned I was a car and driver prior to Automotive News, but I don't have a automotive or gearhead background really. I started in on the topics because I'm a news reporter first and foremost, and these were the topics in the news. So I've always kind of been the news guy at automotive-focused publications.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that's it's starting to become a little bit of a common thread here. It's maybe a little tricky to go from being a true sort of car person to covering this space, and it maybe helps to have kind of a more diverse background. Kirsten, would you say that that's sort of been your experience as well?
Yeah, definitely. Although I entered in a little bit differently than Junko or Pete. I was always a car person and was like big into off-roading and things like that as, in my late teens and things like that. But I became a professional journalist at like 20 years old and was doing sort of the classic covering school boards and education. And around, 24, 25, I became section editor of the business section of a daily newspaper in the Midwest. And it was then that that was it for me. I was very interested in numbers and understanding how that drove the story forward. And so I ended up going and getting my master's in at Medill in Northwestern, and with a focus on economics. And when I came out of that experience, I was all about business reporting, but I was also really interested in technology. And I ended up writing about, if you remember, back in 2007, 2008, there was a lot of interest in investment into clean tech. And part of that was investing in all these new EV startups. And so I was writing about energy, clean tech, and as a result, alternative fuels. And so it was right around that time that I started writing about companies like Solyndra, companies like Coda, companies like Tesla. And that was really my entry point into automotive, but with that look into sort of clean tech and technology, and but around more alternative fuels and business. And it was really Tesla that got me into then writing more about auto. And this was like 2011, I want to say, because of some of what they were doing and their software-centric approach. So then I just sort of saw the winds changing, clean tech falling apart, and more interest shifting into autonomous vehicles or just automation in general, and software and connectivity and electrification. And I sort of just dove right in, and, within a few years, obviously, everything shifted that way too. A lot of money and investment went into that area.
Yeah. So one of the kind of interesting themes that we've already see here is that you kind of have folks. So Kirsten, is at TechCrunch, really famous, tech media outlet, but sort of coming from more of a little bit more of an automotive background a bit with some of your past stuff. Pete, you're sort of covering the technology beat at a very much an automotive outlet, and this is something I definitely saw a little bit of, which is that it seems like maybe this issue of automated driving technology, and even dividing that between ADAS and autonomy, it kind of fits differently in the media landscape. In other words, it's kind of, yes, it's technology, but it's also automotive. Kirsten, let's stay with you for a moment. Like, what has your experience been with that in terms of sort of having an audience and sort of how you approach the technology? Is it a challenge that it's sort of in between these two things, or how do you think about that?
I mean, it is, but I think as a reporter in general, I've had this sort of argument or debate with editors over the years when I've been responsible for hiring people, for example, and discussions about audience come into play. And I'll get asked this question by like PR agencies too, like, what's your angle on this? And what I say is really like reporters should be curious first. And as soon as you think about things like angles, you kind of limit yourself and put the blinders on, if you will, and it's very possible you'll miss a story. So what I do is when I enter into any story, I think about like, what am I most curious about first? And then how am I going to translate that for my audience? Meaning, well, TechCrunch is a mix. We've got people who are incredibly tech focused and savvy, but maybe not so much on the business side, and then vice versa. And so I do a lot of explaining. I try to break down a lot of the jargon, but I understand that there are many people who read these stories who know and are more familiar with jargon than even I am. So it is really a mix. I was at Bloomberg briefly for an internship, and they described it as writing for your Aunt Agatha and a hedge fund investor. And I sort of do the same thing over at TechCrunch, which is, sometimes we rely on jargon because we don't actually understand the technology and we can't explain it. In fact, that's a big thing I ask founders to explain their tech. And if they can't, it raises a few red flags around vaporware. Let's just put it that way. If you can't explain the tech, then you might not understand it. And so that is what I sort of see as my job in terms of my audience. And from there, the rest is open. I don't know if Pete and Junko, if you do the same thing.
Yeah, Junko, it seems like you may be right for an audience that's pretty versed in some of the technical stuff. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm curious about how you see this issue.
Yeah. I actually find myself incredibly fortunate because when, for example, NVIDIA talks about system on chip, that's what I cover, right? Mm-hmm. Most automotive guys don't really care, but the system on chip, how it's designed, which process the node that they're using, and how much it's going to cost, when it's going to come, or is it going to be coming in time? I mean, all this chip-related stuff is something that I have covered for the last 20 years. So I sort of wandered into the automotive, not really knowing what I'm getting into, but it's sort of like the whole automotive industry came to the electronics world, in my view. So I find it very fortunate. Not that I say that I know anything really, but I'm learning a lot about automotive because the business model of automotive industry is very different. So is tech industry, right? So to be able to actually you sort of couched your question as a challenge, but I think that's where the fun is. You get to see both, right? And you get to explain to both audiences what's going on. So I find it very actually fun.
Yeah, you certainly never run out of opportunities to learn. That's been
exactly.
My experience. Yeah. Pete, you work for Automotive News, which is sort of the paper of record really for the auto industry. How does writing for that audience affect sort of how you choose sort of what stories to cover or how you cover them?
It's interesting because I don't think I've ever shied away from writing a story that I really wanted to write just because maybe it didn't kind of hit at that core. But I do find myself like trying to interpret, essentially Silicon Valley, Detroit, and DC, and kind of writing to an audience that either comes from all three places or one of those three places. And while our publication may have kind of a traditionally core automotive focus, I kind of feel like my job is to expand the audience beyond that to, representatives of those other kind of key places on the beat.
Yeah, and sort of related to this, and Pete, will stay with you for a second here. You know, how do you think about and this is something, by the way, that we are constantly grappling with at PAVE, and I think most people in the media as well, is sort of, you know, the audience in terms of niche versus mainstream. Like, do you think there is sort of a real mainstream audience for information about this stuff, and sort of how do you think about the differences of writing something for or covering something for a more mainstream audience versus a more focused audience?
It's a good question. I think it's, you know, there's friction between those things that we probably deal with on a story by story basis. I don't know if I have a great answer, but I do find myself, you know, I'll go back to what I said before. Like, I want to expand beyond our core audience and bring in a new audience. Whether they're there for every story, you know, maybe that's not quite as important, but I do think it's, you know, I don't know if there's a mainstream audience per se, and I know that's one of the challenges a lot of PAVE's members probably have in explaining this technology to a mainstream consumer audience. I don't know that the people who, you know, who we want to reach, who are, you know, buying their first car in 8 years and don't know what a driver assist system is, I don't know if they're paying attention on a day-to-day basis for every story that we write. But it's an interesting topic. I don't know that there's a magic bullet out there just yet.
Absolutely. It's one of the reasons we're having this discussion, right? Is we're all figuring so much of this stuff out as we do it. Junko, do you have thoughts on sort of where you draw the line? Yeah.
Yeah, I think Kirsten had a really good viewpoint there, that in her, she talked about, you know, doing explainer. I think that's absolutely important. Whether you're writing for the niche audience or mainstream audience, that needs to be the baseline. And I come from, even though I write about technology, I write about automotive, I don't presume to know really much, right? Because this is a new area, especially autonomous vehicles is a new area. Nobody really knows, seriously. So I actually take a pleasure of talking to people, asking really basic questions. Why do we need autonomous vehicles, right? And that's a question that cuts across, actually. People who are mainstream audience, you know, they would like to know. I mean, that's the kind of first thing I would ask. I always talk to my husband about, you know, I'm writing about this, and I realize that if I can't explain it well to him, because he's not a technology guy, you know, I realize that I'm not really getting through to any of my audience. But at the same time, that even the people who are in the thickest of this autonomous vehicle thing, they need to be reminded, what is it for? Who is it for, right? So there's a basic questions that cuts across, I think, yeah.
Yeah, so Kirsten, Junko brings up a really good point. There's not only the question of sort of how much do you have to explain based on who your audience is, but also sort of what aspect of a given story are they most interested in? How do you right? I mean, given that, especially online, it can be hard to, you know, get to know your audience in a sort of deep way. How do you think about that challenge?
Well, you're right in that, you know, there are some stories that I will work really hard on and, you know, I won't get much feedback on. So it's difficult to know, you know, is it resonating? But the funny thing is about some of those stories is, like, a year later, someone might be like, I found your piece and it explained this to me really well. So I don't really worry too much about, I think that it can be a mistake to get too worried about how many people are reading your story, for example, and things like that, because it's a bit out of your control. I mean, we live in a world in which, you know, Elon can tweet and someone can report on that, and that will be, you know, the #1 story of the day, when at the same exact time, Pete might have some, you know, investigation that he just spent a month working on, you know, and it's, so you can't really worry about it too much in that flash moment. Really, it's what I base my decisions and how I cover something and how I write about something is, will it stand the test of time? So that comes down to explaining things. So I don't know who is going to find my article at any given time. Most people find online unless they're subscribing, let's say, to Automotive News, a lot of times it's popping up though in Google searches. So depending on, let's say, your SEO for that day, you might end up being in the top Google search, and you get a whole new audience that you didn't anticipate before. So you kind of have to be mindful of that. So explaining things in a clear and concise way, not dumbing things down, but in a clear and concise way, which is harder than you might expect. Also, I go into everything with a primary goal of making people smarter as a result of reading my story and not dumber, meaning not misusing language, using the correct language when it comes to describing things like autonomous vehicles, and not blowing the capabilities of tech beyond, what we know. So there's a difference between marketing language, which many PR people would love for me to use, and reality. Yeah. And so it's important to include those things in every story, and not worry about, all the rest of it that's out of my control.
I think you bring up that test of, when someone read this, is it going to make them smarter? It seems to me, and that's a really good test of whether a piece is adding value, because whether it gets clicks or not is one factor, but and as you say, you don't always have control over that. But whether it makes people smarter or not is something you do have some control over. Pete,
I have a question for you, Ed.
Yeah. Yes.
What is your view of mainstream media, though, or mainstream audience? Like, you were a former journalist, so what is your definition?
I love that you get journalists on it to ask them questions. They can't help but ask questions back. No, I mean, I think this is one of the challenges that we at PAVE are really engaged with a lot, which is sort of, how do we best focus on the audiences, right? If the better you understand an audience, the more effectively you can reach them. And I certainly think that the more general the audience gets, the harder that is in a lot of ways, because this stuff is so complicated. And I was lucky enough to, when I did work as a journalist, I mostly wrote for a more expert audience, which in a way is easier when you're writing about this stuff. And now at PAVE, we really need to reach that more general audience. And so it's really forcing me to think in really different ways about how to communicate that stuff. But I'm the one asking the questions here, Kirsten. Pete, I want to turn to what we all think is probably one of the most important issues. It's one that gets discussed a lot, and like a lot of these, there aren't necessarily, we're still figuring out what some of the answers are here. But recently, the Associated Press style book announced that it was updating its terminology, which brings up this topic that, again, we've all talked about a bit, and I'd love to have you all sort of share how you've approached this question of what are the right ways to describe this technology. I think we've all, evolved and hopefully improved over time, our own use and our own discipline around that. But Pete, I actually want to start with you, because my understanding, and I think I want you to tell this story because I think it illustrates a little bit an element of the media that people don't always understand, which is that we kind of police each other a little bit sometimes. But I understand that you may have had a small hand in this, at least inspiring this decision by the Associated Press. Not that I'm giving you credit for it necessarily, but tell this story.
Right. I don't want to take credit for it. I think that the credit belongs to the Associated Press for updating its style book. But I did have some ongoing discussions with some of the AP writers about their use of self-driving when we're really talking about a driver assist system that requires a human driver in the loop. And I think for all the discussions about marketing terms or jargon or nomenclature, I think that's really what a lot of them boil down to is, or at least the one that we should prioritize is, let's not call things self-driving if they're really not. So I had a couple discussions with them and perhaps pointed out some areas where I thought that the phrasing had been misused, and back to our original point, where eventually there really could be lives on the line when we start describing things as more capable than they actually are. So I don't know if that jump-started those conversations or what, but much to the Associated Press's credit, over a period of months, they They worked on revising their style book. And, you know, maybe not everybody watching knows, but the Associated Press, I think, is kind of a really key outlet, because not only do their stories go in every, you know, news organization's website or mom and pop newspaper across the country, but their style book plays a role in how we all describe, how we all use language, how we all describe this technology. So getting them to revise their style book on these particular entries, I thought was you know, notable progress. That I think it was last month that they updated, and they got rid of, you know, they kind of clarified that distinction between driver assist and self-driving. I don't know if they outlawed semi-autonomous. I think they went with partially automated, which is better than semi-autonomous, because that just doesn't exist in my book. But yeah, so this is real notable progress, and I would think that's something that was on PAVE's radar.
Yeah, and I would note that Pete also is maybe too modest to mention it, but he wrote an op-ed, a sort of an opinion piece about this, and I think that's really cool when, and this is one of the reasons we're doing this panel, is when journalists say, hey, here's something I've learned. You know, normally I'm a reporter, and so I stick to reporting the facts, but here's something I've learned, and I really think it's important for us to move in this direction. Here's why. And so I love it when reporters get into a little bit of opinion. I always did it myself too, but because, you know, I think you learn things as a reporter that other people don't necessarily see. Junko, what has your experience been with this issue of nomenclature and terminology? Is there a standard that you follow? Have you evolved on this issue?
It has evolved, and it's really hard to pin down, actually, because I don't know if you were on the call yesterday with Mercedes-Benz and NVIDIA. I think one of the guys was talking about autonomously assisted features. Is that an ADAS or autopilot, or is that, what is it, right? And then I get the clarification, oh, it's ADAS. Okay, why don't you say ADAS then, right? So it is evolving things, because people tend to use terminology really loosely. So you always have to be ready to ask the follow-up question, does it have drivers in that car, or there's really no drivers in that car, right? So yeah, it's a more of a follow-up, and you actually clarify it when you write it, and that's more important than anything else. I think you need to explain a little bit. Yeah.
And just to stick with you for a second longer, who do you think should be standardizing this stuff? Is this something that journalists should be standardizing the language? Is it you know, SAE? Is it, and I know they've already, you know, joined a consumer report, but you know, is it the AP style book? Where would you want to see this style?
Well, I think you know, somebody like SAE should have a skin in the game, right? Because they're the ones who are looking at all the different levels, and they're the one who actually pioneered this whole level 1 to 5. They should definitely, you know, stick to their guns. This is what we say, what we mean, and they already do that to an extent. But then it is that each technology supplier's marketing department trying to blur the line. And when they started talking about level 2 plus and parking, you know, it's self-parking. I mean, it's all those things to start to erode. So it's really, our question is not policing the language, but ask questions and clarify, I think.
Yeah. So Kirsten, I know we've discussed this a whole bunch on the Autonicast. We even did a South by Southwest panel just on this topic last year. Mm-hmm. Kirsten, what do you think is sort of the most important thing for people to understand about this issue? And maybe if you want to sort of answer also give your answer to my last question to Junko about sort of who you think should be.
Yeah, I mean, Junko makes a really important point, which is that, and if there are any journalists or journalist hopefuls on the call, I think that especially when you're starting out, it's really easy to, for one, be talking to a founder or someone on a team, and they use the terminology and they make you maybe feel like you don't know what you're talking about, or kind of crazy or stupid for asking these questions, when oftentimes it's one of two things. They don't know, actually, and they're using the terminology very loosely, or they're hoping that that terminology is used. So you kind of have to trust your gut and do what Junko said, and just ask really basic questions to clarify, because I was on that call yesterday as well. And, I went back and looked before this to see when I had stopped and when and if I ever used the term semi-autonomous. And in 2014, I did. And I think it's because there was a lack of terminology. There was no way to describe it. And so we were all searching for ways to describe it, but it was an important lesson. As I really learned more and more about the tech and understood its capabilities, that it was more important to explain specifically what that terminology means and what it is capable of doing, more important even than the label that it's given. So let's say we all decided that semi-autonomous was going to be okay. Well, what does that mean exactly? What exactly does that mean that it's able to do? What does autonomous automated driving mean? Well, if it means just parking, well, then you should probably just say just parking.
Right.
So I think it's more important to talk about, though, that's kind of how I approach it more than, like just being okay with feeling a little bit dumb by asking a founder, like, well, what do you mean by this? Because I swear I've been surprised many times by the answers I've received. And it validates me every single time that I'm asking. It's okay to ask those questions.
Yeah, and I think what one of the really important points that was brought up was just that there's awareness now that there are like life and death potential consequences to some of this stuff. That awareness alone was something I think a couple of years ago, a lot of people covering this, but myself even a couple of years ago didn't understand it all. And I think once you understand that it seems like that can oftentimes be sort of the foundation on which you say, okay, this really matters. And I also think that having these kinds of conversations, like with Pete, with Associated Press and us here, and because there are no easy answers, all we can really do is sort of feel our way through it and learn from each other, right?
I will add that I do think that it's good that the AP style guide provided that clarity, because lacking any clarity, then you'll get a mix of different terminology. And I think every newsroom will at least turn to the AP style guide when there is no other source. So I think that it's standardizing language is good, but it's also important to explain what that term actually means in the application of its use, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So this also leads a little bit to one of the really big topics in covering this space. And we actually have a number of participants have asked. Easy Mile has a question sort of related to this. So does the National Safety Council. So something our members are definitely really interested in, that's the question of hype and sort of how you as journalists relate to that hype. And we've seen a bit of a cycle. Junko, I want to start with you. We've sort of gone from this, very hype-driven period to now sort of this kind of very different public perceptions and attitudes about this technology. Has that affected your coverage? And if not, how do you keep it from affecting your coverage?
The truth is that it never really affected us, because unlike EE Times is more grounded. It's read by very skeptical engineers to start with. So if you write anything close to hype, you get hammered by your audience, and that's number one. And the audience keeps us honest. And because when it's technically, if it is not possible, they will tell you, no, you have been snowed. I mean, this is not technically possible. So that's number one. Number two is that also, I think maybe mainstream journals, when you cover so much investment part of the story, that inevitably leads to the hype, right? Because people who invest, the part of the reason that why this became such a big deal, as you describe it as hype, is because there's so much money is in it. I mean, you can't deny the fact that, if somebody's putting so much money in it, maybe there's got to be something there, right? So that it sort of fed each other. It's like covering the business side of the thing. Keep the technology things here, but the business side of this story has gotten even bigger. And that was really hard to ignore even for the press, but more so startups and tech companies who want to pitch their technologies in the market, they just got on with it, right?
Yeah. Kirsten, can you speak to the sort of business role in hype and sort of help people understand how you not being able to know what's happening with proprietary technology or even super cutting edge technology, how do you avoid sort of that pitfall of the hype?
Yeah, and it's important to be, again, that's where curiosity helps. And I don't say being cynical, because again, being cynical about things can actually you can miss a really big story as a result. So entering into anything with just a core sense of curiosity about something, but also, pushing founders to explain the tech. Even with all of that, Junko's right. The amount of money that's involved, I mean, it is easy to get caught up into that cycle and to think, well, all of these investors know more information potentially than I do, so therefore this must be of value. Well, I can tell you that by talking to a number of investors and founders, first of all, it's not clear necessarily that they actually understand the tech. And it's easy for people to be optimistic and hopeful for future and the potential of tech and get caught up in that moment. Our job is to understand what that potential is, but to gut check every single thing we do. The difficulty is, and I'll bring up LiDAR as a classic example. Every LiDAR company out there, I think there are more than 70 right now, talk about, will give very specific terminology and throw it around like it is unique and different, like time of flight. And it's not. And so if you don't know, like, we're really lucky at TechCrunch because we have some people who are like obsessed with, very specific things around software or very specific hardware elements, and relying on your, like at TechCrunch, our expertise. If you're not really clear, like, is this actually something new? Spend that extra half hour or hour to educate yourself and understand that, because these founders aren't going to tell you anything really. A big also red flag for me, and Pete, maybe you've had the experiences, I'm sure Junko has. I've had a number of founders tell, well, I can talk to you about this off record. And I'm like, if you need to go off record to explain the very basics of your technology, then I don't think you're ready to talk to anyone about it. And, call me later. That's the stuff I run into all the time. And it's difficult. Like, I don't have a computer science degree. So how do I navigate that? I navigate that by asking a ton of questions, and then also going to experts who do not have a bias or, will be rooting for one company over another, and then doing a ton of research. That's how I navigate it.
Yeah, Pete, we have sort of a variation of this question from Argo AI, and maybe this is a way for you to get in on this. You three cover this topic in depth and have the insight and savvy to distill fact from fantasy. That's the exception and not the norm. I absolutely agree. That's why you're all here. How would you advise AV companies to approach mainstream press, which often lack the beat experience to make those distinctions quickly? In other words, sort of how, I think this is getting to the question of sort of how do you sort of separate the fiction from the fantasy, because it's an intrinsic challenge of this job, right?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it kind of, in a way, there's fewer of us these days as journalism kind of goes through this, sea change of layoffs that's been accelerated by COVID, but certainly it was a trend before that as well. So I think in a way, PR people have an opportunity to to pitch their stories more directly to reporters who have less time to vet them. So from a journalism perspective, that concerns me. But I guess it does speak to a point that I think these companies have an opportunity to tell their stories. Hopefully they tell it, in a, hype deflated way, but before they even reach out to reporters, I think that they haven't, they can tell their stories better than anybody. But perhaps to Kirsten's point, they need to have a good handle on that. And, at the very least, I have this similar deal where, if we're going off the record 10 seconds into the conversation, that's just such a demoralizing, development on my end. If it's that quickly, it's like, it's an instant red flag that this is probably not worth my time. But getting back to your question, I think that, pitching to reporters who are unfamiliar with it is kind of like get back to the who, what, where, when in a very simplified fashion. And that to me is the easiest way for me to digest something that I may not know all that much about.
Yeah, and both Kirsten and Junko alluded to sort of one of the challenges. I want to get your perspective on this too, of sort of gut checking and how you can gut check something that's very technically sophisticated. And because I often found that it was very hard to find sort of independent sort of sources that I could go to and say, hey, this company's telling me this, how real is that? How do you deal with that challenge? Because obviously you don't want to go to a competitor, right? Or someone, a potential competitor even, because you'll get bias in that. How do you approach that challenge?
But, I think it's kind of keeping, foremost in mind that there is a lot of hype out there. The way I kind of explain it in my head when I'm writing something is what does this product purport to do? And are they actually doing it? How are they doing it? If it sounds too simple, it probably is. Like, as we all know, there's a lot of complexity and nuance to writing about these topics. So if it sounds too good to be true, or too simple, it probably is. So I kind of really check myself on explaining the gap between what it purports to do and what it can actually do here, now, today. And then, when I read my stories back, if there's not a lot of nuance in there, I feel like I'm kind of missing something.
Yeah. And Junko, do you, obviously, as you said, you work with a lot of real hardcore engineers actually on staff. Is that enough, or do you have to sort of look elsewhere to get these sort of gut checks?
I always look elsewhere. I just presume I know nothing, right? So I go to people whom I trust, or it's kind of brain trust, that I just have a set of people that I go to, an independent analysts, or the people in academia, or the hopefully people who don't have skin in the game. That might not be enough, but at least they give their independent viewpoint, which is a learning for me, and potentially it'll be a good learning for our readers as well. It's just, but it's at this day and age, I think we all know that as an online journal, the website, that you're competing for the time and how fast you write. But I think it's also, it's about time when we are writing something so complex as autonomous vehicle. It's really not that important that you have to report this right at this minute. You can take your time, 24 hours. You can do a much better job in terms of, reading through the facts and fantasy, and 24-hour late story turned out to be more educational to the general public, but also potentially people are in this industry as well. So I think we should have a courage. I like what Kirsten and Pete said. When the vendor is telling you that they can't talk about it, it's off the record, or you have to have NDA. I think journalists have to have the courage to say, okay, that's the end of the conversation. Right. And I think we have to have the courage to say that, because otherwise, who are keeping these people honest? I think we just get caught up in the whole cycle of we got to pump out stories as soon as possible, as they say. And that's the trap that we get into.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would agree with Junko, and I would even say that it's important for journalists to understand that a game is played with embargoes and breaking news, in which the hope is, and maybe not the intention, but the result is that everyone jumps to try and be first, and they're counting on that.
Yeah.
Because when you're first, unless you somehow have some incredible insight or background, and you could easily miss something. And I'm not saying that every journalist who is first lands into that, but especially it's like the classic Friday night news dump. And it's, it reminds me of when I get a tip, like we're about to announce this, there is a possibility that they're counting on everyone scrambling to get that story out first without stopping and asking a couple of key questions, being maybe 3 hours later, but guess what? Finding out something actually new. And, I won't, dig into like a long story about this, but, recently, for example, a company put out a video and a release, and, everyone wrote essentially the same story. I was 2 hours later because I needed clarification on 2 questions. And guess what? Oh, production has been postponed 6 months. Well, that was my story. So it's really like being okay, having the courage, as Junko said, to be maybe a little late. Your editors might not like it. But if you start to have the trust of readers, then you will end up having more people coming to you. And actually, as a result, more industry sources coming to you because they know that you're going to, cut through the noise and get to what is actually real.
I think this is such an important point because, especially with online media being what it is, the pressure to just be first is so strong. And you're right, as Junko said, I mean, this technology is so complex. It's really worth taking the extra time. Certainly from our perspective as an educational organization, we really appreciate it when reporters take the time to really get into the nuance because it's hard to do fast for all those reasons that, that we've been discussing. Pete, I don't want to leave this question with Kirsten because we'll hear a lot and we'll get to her, but FLIR, our friends at FLIR want to know, beyond just general tips for PR professionals in terms of how to pitch for this stuff, they also want to know, and I love that they ask this, conversely, is there anything that PR professionals do that is really annoying and that you want them to stop?
It's funny, I get that question a lot from PR people. And by and large, like, I know there's like a lot of griping elsewhere, but I've had a largely like very positive, working relationships with communications people, and probably could count the ones that don't fall into that category on one hand. So I think if there's one annoying thing, I would say, like, if you've pitched me something like 8 times, and you kind of get the email that's like, 4th, 5th, or 6th time, like, hey, just checking in if you saw this. Like, if I haven't responded by then, it's not that I'm being rude, but as I'm sure with you guys, like, the inbox like could consume my entire day. If I responded to every email I got, I would get nothing.
Oh dear. We may have lost Pete temporarily. Junko, let's get your perspective on this. What are the things that PR folks, the good ones do, and sort of what's the most annoying things?
Yeah, it's. I think Pete is absolutely right. I mean, it's like it being badgered by the PR folks, for like 5 times. Oh, maybe I'm missing something, right? So, I don't mind being reminded a couple of times, but maybe that I should have said right off the bat, I'll get back to you when I'm interested, right, or when I have time. But no, I think it's I think that really the most important thing is don't start your press release by saying that this is going to save people's lives. I wish people stop saying that. I mean, it may save people's lives on long term, but your single technology is not going to solve the problem. So let's talk about, let's be honest. I mean, I know you want to pitch this story and you want to couch it in a socially conscious way, but don't make it in the first or second paragraph. Let's talk about the limitations that we have today. I mean, I wish the vendors could take their time to explain the limitations that we have today, and what they are pitching might be part of the solution, but not going to be the whole solution, right? So I think that this whole conversation is about how the journalists cover this, but I think the PR folks, also PR community, also need to understand. Let's talk about issues. Let's talk about now. This is the XYZ things that is the best thing on earth is not going to cut it. Tell me about what problems you see on the road. Tell me what are the things that you see that's red flag. Let's discuss that. Let's set aside a time and let's discuss that, right? And I would appreciate that kind of background briefing very much. I think they should take their time to do that if they could. Yeah.
That's a really fantastic point. And Kirsten, no discussion of this would be complete without your views. I know, again, another topic that you and I have talked about a lot, but just share some of your thoughts on.
I'll try to be pretty succinct. Like, if I were to change anything, here, like any PR person, comms person sitting on the line, like I probably get 350 pitches a day in my inbox. I also get phone calls. I got 3 while during this asking me, and texts asking me if I saw XYZ. So I understand persistence, but I think that Bloomberg had a report last year that PR people to journalists we're outnumbered 7-1. So let's get back to basics. What is news? News is a surprise. That's why we write about the man biting the dog and not the dog biting the man. I'm not saying that every pitch should fall under, is this news? But if you cannot answer that basic question, then perhaps you are promising that startup that I'm going to write about a sensor that you cannot explain. It's just not going to happen. So, then there are the stories that are interesting tech deep dives. And that's why I like sort of Pete's back, yay. That's why I like, I enjoy those pitches. It's great if I have the time to do that and to do those deep dives. But again, if you can't explain the tech simply in a clear way that doesn't rely on jargon, then again, I'm probably going to delete that message. So, be clear with the, startups that you've been hired to represent, what is really possible, and don't overpromise coverage. I think that there is a system in place in which coverage is promised, and as a result, they pester journalists a lot. Be aware of what is defined as news. And then instead of a long, 5-page press release filled with jargon, send me an email with 3 bullet points. Why does this matter? Why should I care? What is the tech? And then I'll interview the CEO or the investor or whoever the sources you're pitching. I think that's a lot more respectful of our time and allows us to sort of, and it probably saves comms people a lot of time as well. And then the only other thing I would say is, when there is a disaster or there is something unfortunate that happens to a company, do not pitch your source as someone who can weigh in on the topic or seem opportunistic, because I will ignore it. So I saw that a lot right after the Uber, self-driving vehicle crash or that fatality of the pedestrian Elaine Hertzberg. A number of companies jumping on that to weigh in. And I just think that that's just a mistake. So avoid it.
Yeah. So we have a bunch more questions from our members, and it's funny, most of our panels have been half an hour, and this one we're almost at the hour mark, and it's just gone by because this is such fascinating stuff. But I wanted to get from each of you, again, even though there's a lot we could be discussing, I really want to make sure that in case there are any future aspiring journalists out there, and particularly people who see the challenge that you're all discussing here today, what is your advice to young people, maybe in college or high school, even about sort of how to approach, working towards being in the position that you're in today. And we'll start with Pete.
Well, first of all, Kirsten mentioned this earlier, but boy, I wish I had a computer science background sometimes. But I think, my advice would be not only to have that to cover technology, but have a curiosity about lots of different things. There's so many times where I think my personal interest in history kind of plays these fortuitous roles in things that I wind up covering or writing about or working into my coverage. So I think if you're curious about lots of different subjects, there's a way to channel that into whatever it is you wind up covering.
That's a great point. I think that's one of the most fascinating things about AVs is that wherever you're coming from, you can find, some way that it touches this technology, right? Or the potential impact on the world. Junko, what would your advice be to aspiring AV or automated driving journalists?
I think be curious, be skeptical, and be diligent. I think those are 3 advices. Yeah.
That's very succinct and all extremely good advice. Kirsten, what would you say?
I won't be that succinct. Sorry, Ed. But Junko and Pete are correct. I think that's finding, going to undergrad and exploring different specialties that don't necessarily fall under a journalism degree are really important, because it gives you, journalism honestly is the pursuit of facts and, using diligence and also hopefully some innate curiosity, and you're constantly learning new things. So specializing in economics, for example, or computer science or political science, or it gives you greater, a broader sort of pool of information to pull from as you're writing, and that really helps. So I would, and then also, if you want to be a good writer, read more. And there's nothing limiting you as you are pursuing a journalism degree to also take a class on coding and to dig in and find experts. I mean, students have people talk to students. I mean, they don't talk to journalists, but man, go just hit up any AV founder and say, how do I learn this? Or how do I do this? And I think that in our society, we have an openness to talking and teaching students, and this is the time to take advantage of it, because you probably have more access than we do. And just pursue that. There's tons of online courses to sort of improve your technological understanding and whatever topic you plan on pursuing.
Yeah, no, this is all fantastic advice. I think if I were to join in for a moment as a former journalist, I would say, one of the aha moments when I first, and I kind of chanced into media work without intending to really, and the aha moment for me was realizing this is basically just like the 3 years in middle school that I spent homeschooling. I would just pick, you'd have something that you would need to understand, and you have to go out and you have to find the best sources of information for that and bring them together and do that. And if you learn the practice and more importantly, even you learn to enjoy self-education, that's really what journalism is. You're educating yourself and you're sharing what you learn. And that's, it's a habit that you have to cultivate, but it's also there's a joy to it that you really have to be able to tap into. And if you have those things, I think you can cover anything well as a journalist. And frankly, I think this area specifically is so complex and challenging that you really need to have those things. And certainly all 3 of you, I think, exemplify that spirit. And we really appreciate all 3 of you taking the time out of your busy days to come and share what you've learned covering this space. Junko, Yoshida, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Pete Bigelow from Automotive News. Thank you so much, Pete.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And Kirsten, always fun chatting. Thanks for making the time for us.
Thank you.
And that concludes our 8th virtual panel. This will be available later on our YouTube account. I encourage you to go there and see some of our past panels if you have the time. And with that, we thank you all for taking time out of your day to come and join us for this discussion. And we will see you here again next week.